Hello and welcome back. I've finished the plane to the point of where I'd like it to be. As I've said in the past, I don't like to over restore them. I like to keep some of the history to it. So it's working really well. Considering the size of the plane, I'm surprised how fine a shaving it takes, really. So I decided not to paint it. I left it as it was, and I've just treated it with a rust treatment on the paint. Something like this type of stuff, a rust converter. And when you paint it on, it goes black anyway, so I like to keep the character of it, so I decided not to repaint it, but to do it with that. The handles, excuse me a minute, the handles I did with Danish oil. I did like to use gunstock oil, but I found out it's quite expensive to buy and it's got a very short shelf life. So I've started using Danish oil now. So that's what I've done the handles with. So flattening the bed was done with sandpaper and a piece of glass. It was quite a job because it was quite a way out. The other problem I had with it was, well, for me anyway, the guy who owned it before he'd stamped his initials on the side, which I can live with that, but on all four corners with an engraver he'd put his full name scrawled into it, and I couldn't really live with that. It was a bit of a mess. He'd also done the blade, which you can still, perhaps if I put my hand there, you might be able to see on the blade, he's also engraved his name on there and on the chip breaker. So he got a bit carried away. So with that, I decided that I'd have to go a bit heavy on it, really, a bit heavier than I'd normally do. I don't like doing it, but I decided I'd have to file this off, well, grind it off, and I used one of these kind of flat wheel, I suppose, that goes on a grinder, and dress the side off to get the engraving out of it. As it happened, it took the initials out of it as well, so it's cleaned up really well. This might not be straight now, might not be square to the bed or straight, but I don't think anybody's going to be using one of these on a shooting board personally. So for me it doesn't matter, and I don't think it would matter for most people. So it was a bit of a brutal way to go about it, but there wasn't really any option. There wasn't a lot of pitting in it, shockingly enough, considering the state it was in. There really wasn't much pitting in it, and you can see a little bit here, but it was surprisingly good. It looked a mess, it looked a wreck. In fact, when I bought it, I wasn't sure whether it was retrievable. So I think it's turned out well. I'm pleased with it. It works nice, and it's not as hard a work to push as I thought it would be. It's actually a pleasure to use. The weight of it is an advantage. It's a little bit lighter because it's got the corrugated sole on it. So to go through the main problems with it, the first thing was the sole, which was high at both ends and around the mouth. So I flattened that out. It probably took me 2 hours on 60 grit sandpaper to get that. There was still one or two what I call pools, so there's one or two areas, like isolated areas, where the casting's shallow. But getting those out is pretty pointless and a lot of work for nothing, so I just sanded those out by hand because they're not going to be detrimental to the way the plane works. So I've come to the conclusion this plane had hardly been used, which is what I suspected when I took it apart, because it's got a full length blade in it, and my experience, you buy an old plane that hasn't been used, it's usually a dog, meaning there's something quite badly wrong with it. And I think that was the case with this one. I think it'd been a dog out the factory, and I think that's why it wasn't used and it got abandoned. The reason is the frog. I've got a spare one here, which is easier to thing. The actual frog was like it was rounded this way, so high in the middle and a long way out. That's unlikely. Well, it may have moved after it was machined. It wasn't machined on these top corners here. So I took a file to it and set about. Some people take the lever off them, but I found that to be a risky business because I haven't been able to get back on successfully, and sometimes I've cracked the casting where it's thin here. So I tend to leave those on now, and I get a flat file and I just work it across and diagonally and just keep working around it until I get a flat surface. And I check that I've got a spare plane bed, but it's flat, and I put it on there and see what progress I've made and whether it looks okay until I'm happy with it. One word of caution there, I use cheap files, I don't buy expensive mill files, but they're not all dead straight. So just keep an eye if you do that your file's straight, or you're aware that there's a bit of curve in it. So that sorted the frog out. The next thing was the blade. Well, the blade was a horrible shape. It was twisted and it was bent the opposite way to the frog. So where the frog was a hump, the blade was a hump that way. So basically there were two bananas back to back. Well, whoever had it had hit it with a hammer several times. You can see the marks here, but they go further down and into the blade. You can see a slight crease in the blade there where it's gone out of focus. Yeah, where you can see a crease where it's bent the metal. So I think out of desperation someone had tried to use the blade or tried to sharpen it and realised what a bad shape it was. And of course they'd only have, it's about 1930, so they'd only have an oil stone really to flatten it off with. It'd be quite a job. So I think they'd laid into it with a hammer to try and shape it a bit, but it just made things worse. And the blade had its original factory grind on it. The back of the blade hadn't been fully flattened. Well, I suppose it couldn't be because of the shape it was in. And it had just had one edge put on it from new. The factory grind was still on there. So this plane had just given up. And someone more recently had used it to try and plane some old wood off with paint on, but it was obviously given up right from the very beginning. The other issue with it was that this adjuster here, there, was right, it's not focusing very well, excuse me a minute. This adjuster here was right up against the casting, and it was tight up to the casting, it had barely withdraw the blade below the bed. So the problem there is, if you ever have that problem, it's the chip breaker that's too long. So from this this hole here where your adjuster goes in to the end of the chip breaker is too long. So what I had to do was grind about 2 millimeters off the front of the chip breaker and refile at an angle like that so that you've got some clearance on it. See if it'll focus. Right, let's see. There we go. So I file it back in like that so that it's got a bit of clearance on the back of it, until I'm happy with it. And then I do the same. I put it on the plane on a flat surface, and I see that it's not rocking, it's flat and it's sitting tight. Sometimes you have too much of a gap here. You don't need much of a gap there. A couple of millimeters is enough. If you have too much when you tighten it up, it bends your blade, and that effectively makes the blade round. If you shorten a chip breaker and you find that when you put it on a flat surface it's not touching where you've ground the front edge off, here it might not be actually touching, or there might be no gap there, you can actually bend them. So these aren't hardened, although some of them are quite tough, they're not hardened metal, and if you put them in a vise you can crank that to give it a bit of set. So you might have to do that. You can also twist them if they're not sitting flat, you can twist them slightly. So that sorted the chip breaker and the adjuster out. And that was about it then. I tinkered with the blade. It was in a bad way. This bent this way. So it was not possible to flatten the back really, so it happens to be a very hard blade, one of the hardest ones I've had steel wise, a bit like A2 in a funny sort of way, but what I had to do was shape it. Usually it's only this bit from here down that's been hardened, so you can't change that, but you can't bend it. But if you put them on a radiator and get them warmed, we're not talking hot, we're not talking below torch hot, but if you put it on a radiator and get it nice and warm, you can get these in, if you're better with a vise with wooden jaws on, like a woodworker's vise, you can cramp that there and you can bend this bit down from here to there. You can shape it and bend it, and by looking down it and sighting it, you can straighten it. And if it's twisted, you can put a screwdriver in there, put that in the vise and take the twist out of it. And it's a case of patience and fiddling. And again, I use the same method. When it'll sit, this one hasn't been done by the way, this is just an old blade, but you can see that now. Well, I'd work on that until that sat on that steel flat. But it's surprising how much you can move them and what you can get out of them if you're careful, but make sure they're warm. Because if it's really icy cold, you can snap them off. I have done it myself. So get it nice and warm and straighten it out. Because I couldn't straighten this piece out, and this was round here, this part was round here, I had to get it on a diamond stone and put it right on the edge of a diamond stone like that, so I wasn't touching this front edge, and I had to hollow a coarse diamond stone. I had to hollow that part of the blade out with a diamond stone until I got it to a point where I could get a flat surface on here. That was quite a job, that was hard work. But it got there in the end. Something I hadn't realised when I bought it is these blades are like I thought these were 4.5s. So I thought they were 2 3/8 wide, but these are 2 5/8 wide. There's only this plane that takes this with the blade, and you can't buy a new one. You might be able to pick a second-hand one up, but there are a couple of companies. Hock is one of them, and just trying to recall the name of the other. There's 2 companies that sell aftermarket blades, better quality, so they're not cheap, but you could get one if you wanted to. Ray Isles, that's it, that's the other company's called Ray Isles. These tend to be a little bit cheaper, but they're good quality. So then that's sorted it, and I'm pleased with it now. Having bought it for £150 and gambled it might be scrap, it's a nice plane to use. So what's occurred to me after that, now it's all finished and dusted and the problems, I started to ponder over if someone bought it in the 1930s when times were hard, it was probably, from my looking it up, wages were about £1 a week. That's an English pound, but those pounds then had 240 pennies in them. So not like the pound today that has 100 pennies in it. So when you were you even had quarter-penny coins. So what would that be? If you've got 240 pennies, you've got 960 quarter pennies. So that's how a pound got split down to be able to, well, basically live on. But a plane like this then would have been about 10 shillings. Well, a shilling was 12 pence. So it's roughly £0.5, half of your wage for a week. So I was pondering over why somebody spent half his wages on probably saved up to buy a plane with half a wage packet, and then put his name all over it, because he was obviously working with other people, because otherwise he wouldn't have bothered naming it so much, and the blade and everything. And the hole that he drilled in here is, I've noticed, is very accurately drilled. It's been done on a pillar drill. It's not been done by hand, and that could have only been done in a workshop, and people wouldn't have had that sort of equipment at home in those days. So it would appear that he was working in quite a large place, and where this came from was Barnstable in North Devon. So when I looked that up, there was a big cabinet makers there that made freestanding household furniture, but they also fitted bars out, and restaurants, shops, interiors. They did the interiors of the Pullman train coaches, and they also did the interiors of ships. And there was about 400 men working there, so it was a big concern, considering Barnstable's quite a small town. So it's not unreasonable to think that the guy was probably working there. His name was Jack Randall. And the only thing I can think of is he must have bought it and couldn't make anything of it, and it just got abandoned. This did happen because a misconception is that tradesmen had fettled the tools when they got them, that they take all the corners off and make sure they were flat and all that, but actually it's not the case. it was the same when I was serving my apprenticeship. Nobody messed with a tool. When they got a new tool, they didn't attack it with a sandpaper and a file and mess around with it. They just used it as it was, and it was either a good one or a bad one. And if it used to say if your plane didn't work well, you hadn't used it well enough. So in other words, keep using it. And I suppose what you're doing then, you're wearing the high spots off, you're wearing corners off, and eventually the blade will become flat and so on and so forth. But they also wouldn't have possibly had the opportunities we've got today to flatten things, because like sandpaper wouldn't come in rolls then, it would be packs of sheets, probably about so big would be a pack of sheet of sandpaper. So sort of fettling it then, and you'd only got oil stones, there was no sort of diamond stones or anything like that. It probably wasn't really feasible to correct it. And it brings back something that I've experienced myself. 1978, I started college in 77. In 78 I was on site, and my sister bought me a Stanley 5.5, and it was a dog. The mouth kept blocking up on it, and I eventually realised some of it was the chip breaker, so I filed that to fit, and that helped. But the mouth, it still block up with shavings all the time, and couldn't move the mouth back any further, because a misconception is you move the frog back and the mouth you get more room, but there's a finite point to where the frog will come back further than is practical. So what will actually happen is the bevel will start to catch the bed here, and it will start riding on that part of the bed and not on only on the top half here of the frog, this bit. So you're rubbing the bevel of the blade across this bevel that's on the bed here. That causes problems with adjustment, because the more you put it in, the tighter it gets, and the more you pull it out, the slacker it gets, because it's riding the bevel of the blade. And in worst cases, and I've seen it done, if you have your blade resting on that part of the casting and you hit something hard with it, you're planing something hard, it'll take a chunk. Some of these are quite thin at this point. Some of them are only 2 millimeters thick, and it'll take a chunk out of there. Because it wasn't sitting on the frog, it'll knock a chunk out the casting. So there is a finite amount that you can pull a frog back, and mine pulled back as far as it would still clog up. So I said to one of the old boys, I was fed up with it, I said I was going to file the mouth out on it, and his words were to me, "Don't touch it, you'll ruin it." He said, "If you file the mouth, it'll never work right again." But I was that frustrated, I filed the front of the mouth out with it. And after that, it was perfect. But as I said, tradesmen didn't really mess with the tools. They bought them off the shelf and they used them, and they kind of broke them in with use. So this one was beyond being able to be broken in with use. It was miles out. So that probably explains why it got left, and it is where it is today. So yes, Mr. Jack Randall, who undoubtedly bought it new, God bless him, he won't be with us now. And I think that's probably the history of it. It makes sense, the time, the place, and the condition of the plane. It makes sense. That was probably what happened. So I hope this has been of interest to somebody, and once again, thanks for watching and take care.